Good afternoon and welcome to ABGSC Investor Days. My name is Jesper Birch Jensen and I work as an equity research analyst here at ABG. And with us today we have the CEO of G5 Entertainment, Vlad Suglobov. He's going to tell us a little bit about the company and their plans for the future. With that said, please go ahead, Vlad.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying until the last presentation of the day. As Jesper said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of G5 Entertainment. We are making mobile games, casual games, and we identify our primary audience as women over 35 years old. They comprise about 70% of the company's audience. Let's go through the presentation and switch to the next slide. You can see we had quite a dynamic development over the years in terms of the revenue and earnings as well. We are operating on a global and huge market, which is the fastest growing part of the video game industry. We have 7 offices in different locations around the world, with our development offices primarily in Eastern Europe, which gives us a unique advantage in terms of the cost and the class of the game development talent. We've created some very successful games in our history. The Secret Society made over $130 million in sales and achieved 30 million downloads. Hidden City exceeded that, made about $330 million to date and achieved 17 million downloads. And we have released 7 games in 2020. We have one more which we may release until the end of the year. Maybe it's going to be on the edge of the years. But there's one more game that we have prepared for this year. And then our plans for the next year include about 5 or 6 games. I think I said 6 in the previous report. So we have quite a lot of stuff going on in terms of the development pipeline. We've been listed on Nasdaq Stockholm since June 2014. And we were public in Stockholm since 2006. We were previously listed on NGM Nordic and then Aktier. And then in 2014, we relisted to Nasdaq Stockholm. And we received some awards for the quite dynamic growth that we have had over the years. Let's move on to the next slide. So the market we operate on continues growing. The largest part of that market is Asia, but we are not that active in that part of the market. Most of our sales are in North America, about 58% as of the last quarter, but still we have 15% of sales in Asia, about 21% in Europe. There is strong underlying growth in the market of mobile games, and of course, it has received extra attention this year due to lockdowns. A lot of new players were introduced to mobile games as they try to, find something to do and entertain themselves during the lockdowns. We believe that this can be a very good boost for the industry and ourselves as well. That will not really go away because our games are designed in a way that they're very enjoyable. And so once you are you're used to playing our games, there's a good chance you will come back to playing our games. We, in a way, these lockdowns were kind of a free promotion for the company's products and other mobile games. And I think this will accelerate people moving into mobile games, playing mobile games. And, it will just help move the industry forward. Going forward is going to be a good, a positive wave to ride, so to speak, even if the pace of growth for the overall market can not be going forward, may not be as fast as it was this year. So, I think we covered this one. Let's go over to the next slide, please. So mobile games is a relatively new phenomenon. They have started appearing around 1997, as you can see from this amazing infographic. And then around 2008 was when the iPhone came out, and this really changed the dynamic of the growth of the underlying market. With this change of generation of the phones and the introduction of tablets, the market quickly became the fastest growing part of the overall games market. And this is the market we are operating on. And obviously, this is also the market. I mean, this is the reason we were able to grow so fast. But at the same time, this market continues to be growing really fast. And as you can see, it now accounts for almost half the revenue of the mobile games industry. Let's move on to the next one. Thank you. If you look over the last few years of G5's history, what happened was that until 2008, we have reached unprecedented revenues on the quarterly and annual basis. A lot of that revenue was driven by the licensed games, the games that G5 did not develop internally, but rather G5 has published. At the same time, we continued developing games ever since the company was founded. So we already had a strong development teams inside the company, and we had some very successful games that we have developed internally as well, like Mahjong Journey, for example. But a couple of years ago, we decided that we really need to focus on developing more games internally and to raise the quality bar. We had the means of doing that. We just needed time. We needed to hire more people, create more teams. And we wanted to create all the new games that we used to source from external developers, but this time do it internally. We could afford this investment, and we could afford potential downside, as not all games are equally successful, but this would expose us to a lot of upside, and we would not need to share as much revenue with the developers. And we believe that we had the knowledge and the understanding of the market to be able to be successful with our own internally developed games, even on a higher scale. So we started hiring more people around 2016. As you can see, we went from about 300 to about 700 total number of people in the company. And we started releasing what we call a new generation of internally developed games in the summer of 2019. And as you can see, there was this point between Q2 and Q3 2019 when the quarterly revenue from own games started growing substantially. And then we had this quite amazing jump from Q1 to Q2 this year. And as I have mentioned, we have benefited in a way from the situation with the lockdowns, because a lot of people had nothing better to do but play mobile games. So we were happy to be there for them to provide some entertainment. And a lot of people have downloaded our games over the second quarter specifically. And for us, it has been almost like a free marketing in a way. And this, we are still enjoying, I think, the increased attention. And Q3 is not even the strongest quarter of the year. Usually it's kind of on a weaker side, but we continue to see strong performance in the third quarter and now in the fourth quarter. Although the lockdown effect is not as strong, we still see the increase in the number of downloads that we believe in part is seasonal, because Q4 and Q1 are seasonally stronger quarters with many people staying inside and playing more games. But also with reintroduction of lockdowns, even on a smaller scale, there's even more incentive for people to stay home and enjoy mobile games. So we really look forward to the rest of the fourth quarter and the first quarter next year, as this is historically the strongest period of the year for the company. Let's move on to the next slide. So the games that we offer our users vary in genre, but they all appeal to the same demographic, which we can see is predominant demographic among our audience. There's hidden object games where you try to find objects, but there's a lot more than that. But the core gameplay is that you try to find objects on these beautifully rendered backgrounds. And the latest example from that genre is the game called Sherlock that we have released just a couple of months ago, maybe a bit more than a month. There's match 3 games. And although this is the second smallest genre for us, the first one being hidden object, match 3 games already account for a substantial percentage of the company's revenue. We make millions of dollars on a monthly basis, and the overall market for match 3 games is huge. It's way bigger than hidden object, and we only have a tiny slice of this market. So this market presents the biggest opportunity for us. Probably if we can get to having 1% of this market, this would already be several times over in terms of the current revenue that we're generating from this market. There's also Mahjong solitaire market where we have a sizable percentage of the overall worldwide market. We are one of the leading developers in this genre. And we have Mahjong solitaire, Mahjong journey game there as our largest, but we have the new generation of Mahjong games that are also catching up quickly. We also have one game in word puzzles category, which is doing quite well, but nothing special yet. And all of our games are connected by the G5 Friends network. I think it's becoming even more important given the situation where everyone is spending more time at home, and it allows you to play with friends, communicate with friends, buy gifts for friends. And we can see that the usage of this network is growing over time. And we've been doing this for many years. It was always our vision that games are naturally a social network for people who play them. Let's move on to the next slide, please. The way we develop games and kind of our thinking and our strategy in that regard is that we think of our offering in the market as a portfolio. It is difficult to predict which games will be successful, which games will not be very successful. So we always think in terms of creating a number of games where each game is kind of we're trying to test the thesis that this type of game is going to be popular in the market, and we try to place these bets, but the outcome is determined by the performance of the whole portfolio rather than one game. Sometimes we have runaway successes, like happened with the Secret Society, Hidden City, and prior to that with our own games, Mahjong Journey and Virtual City Playground, and these stars drive the performance of the whole portfolio. But we can work with having these stars, and in the absence of these stars, we can still continue performing and showing great performance and great profitability. So as you can see, from 2019 to 2020, the revenue from owned games now comprises about 62% of total revenue of the company, and that's quite a reversal of the situation a couple of years ago when it was only 30%. So there has been great progress there. And while our licensed portfolio has been going down gradually over time, still generating very strong cash flow and a lot of profits for us, it was declining. And then the revenue from the new games released from 2019 has been kind of replacing that revenue. And these are the games that have been growing over the last year. Some of the games that were driving growth during this period of time is Jewels of Rome, Jewels of the Wild West, Jewels of Egypt, and Meshtown Makeover. And now Sherlock is performing very well and also driving the top line growth. I've mentioned we have released 7 games in 2020. We have more development teams than we've ever had. So as you can imagine, we are developing all within the framework of a portfolio of games. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So on this slide, we have kind of a theoretical chart of the revenue performance from a single game in a portfolio. And obviously, we start with creating a minimum viable prototype. A game that is complete and provides full experience for the player, but at the same time, it has just enough content for maybe a couple of months. And we release that game to the market. We look at the analytics and how well it is performing. And if it performs well, we start scaling the game with the user acquisition, and that is paid marketing. And we go through the period of growth. Eventually, a game usually achieves some sort of ceiling, which can be overcome by improvements to the game or improvements to the marketing strategy, but usually it peaks at some point. And this is the point where the game is no longer contributing so much to the growth of the top line, but it starts to contribute a lot to the profitability. And as you can see, most of the profits of the game is actually made after it has peaked, so to speak, and after it has stabilized on a certain level where we don't spend as much money on user acquisition, we just collect the money from previously acquired users, and we spend only a limited amount of money reinvesting in user acquisition. And that's the situation right now with the older part of our portfolio. Although it is stagnating gradually or flat, we are making a lot of profits, and most of the profits that this portfolio is going to make is still ahead of us. So you can think of it as money in the bank, but you are collecting them gradually. So that's the older part of the company's portfolio. And then the new part of our portfolio, the new generation of games, is showing really strong growth. For example, in the last quarter that we have reported, it was plus 72% year over year for own games and plus 425% year over year for the new generation of games. Let's move on to the next slide. So once we launch the games, they are kind of in the left bottom corner, according to this diagram. And depending on how well they perform, how far they can reach in terms of the monthly revenue, they become stars. Or if they do not become stars, but we still want to make money from them, we move them to the harvest mode to the right, and they become small cash cows, and we just try to take back the money that we have invested in the development of the game and then some. And most of the games that we develop, they actually are profitable over their lifetime, even if they're not adding a lot to the top line of the company. We do get the money back with a healthy margin. There are of course a few games that have lost the money to the company, but that's part of the portfolio approach. You have some losers. You have some average performance, and then you have some really strong performers. Some games like Hidden City, The Secret Society, Mahjong Journey become so big in terms of the monthly revenue that we call them the big cash cows. And we never really remove the team from these games because we continue making updates because there's a large audience and large revenue that justifies making monthly updates. And this can happen over many, many years while we are collecting profits from this type of games. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the third quarter of this year really shows what I've been saying is that we were riding fundamental, several very important waves. Obviously, one is environmental in the sense that this is the way the lockdowns worked for the companies, that we had much more attention from the players in the second quarter. And I think some of that continued into the third quarter, although there was quite a cooling down in that regard. But there are two fundamental changes in the company over the last couple of years that are really showing the results right now. And one is that those extra teams that we have and all these new games, new generation of games we have launched since summer of 2019. And the second one is the improvements we have made to user acquisition. We have changed the management in user acquisition about a year ago. And then for some time, they were looking at what's going on with the company and coming up with the recommendations. And starting at the beginning of 2020, we were able to optimize our user acquisition spend quite a lot by introducing additional tools, by kind of reshaping the process that we use to do it, and by adding more user acquisition managers for a more granular approach. And so in 2020, we see that we are spending a smaller percentage of our revenue back into user acquisition, and that has really affected the profit margins positively. And the fact that 62% of revenue is generated by own games, and on this part of the revenue we don't pay royalty, was another big factor for the expansion of the profitability of the company. And we believe that both of these factors will continue going forward. Even lockdown situation may or may not continue. We all hope it's going to be over soon. We're happy to be there for the players in the meantime. But I also think that the biggest impact from the lockdowns is already behind us. And what we are seeing now is that just people enjoying their mobile games and seasonally strong quarters ahead of us. Just because everyone wants some entertainment and something good after this year. So the results of the third quarter were, as I mentioned, quite strong. Own games grew to 62% of total revenue. Was only 54% in the second quarter. The growth of own games year over year was 72%. New releases performed really well. And another interesting metric that we're tracking is the monthly average gross revenue per paying user. It's the metric of monetization of our users, how well they're paying. It actually increased 31% year over year compared to last year. And that is due to two reasons. One is that more people in our audience are playing match 3 games, and they are higher monetizing than Hidden Object. And the second thing is that because of the improvements to our user acquisition process, we were able to acquire higher quality of users in terms of monetization. Let's move on to the next slide. So when you look at our revenue in Swedish kroner, you have to remember we do not really have revenue in Swedish kroner. 58% of our revenue is in USD, 15% mostly in Japanese yen, and 21% in euro. So we report in SEK, and that distorts the picture a little bit. So while the revenue year over year in Q3 went up 10%, the underlying growth in constant exchange rates is actually stronger. And sequentially from Q2 to Q3, in Swedish kroner, the growth of own games wasn't as spectacular. But again, adjusted for FX, there was a 13% advancement, just quarter to quarter, in terms of revenue from own games. I think I covered other metrics, so let's move on to the next slide. As I mentioned, we have these fundamental improvements in the business that have allowed us to substantially expand earnings margin this year in 2020. And as you can see, this already started in Q1 before we even had any effect from lockdowns and COVID-19. So we continue in that regard, and there's strong performance in earnings. And it is important to understand that this is driven by fundamental changes to the business. One, larger percentage of revenues generated by own games, and another is much more efficient user acquisition spending. And having all these new releases marketed efficiently leads to the expansion of earnings margin and the gradual expansion of gross margin as well. Let's move on to the next slide. In terms of cash flow, we're doing really well. We have zero debt. We are putting money into the account pretty much every month. And you can see that at the end of the Q3 this year, we had the highest cash balance for this time of the year. And this is despite paying out a dividend this year and also spending, I think, about twice that amount on the buybacks, given good market situation. So the cash flow is strong, cash conversion is strong. There's zero debt, and we continue investing part of that cash back into developing new games, and we have more than enough to continue developing new games and bringing them to the market this year and next. Let's move on to the next slide. So the outlook for the company is really bright, actually. the revenue from own games continues growing, and the revenue of the company becomes more diversified. We're not as dependent on a single game as we used to be. Having a star in a portfolio that accounts for a large percentage of your revenue is great in some respect, but also kind of a little bit more risky because you depend so much on the dynamic of one single game. And I think we are moving into, for now at least, to another phase of our development when we are not really that dependent on any single game, and it is a much more diversified portfolio of games. So you can expect us to deliver more stable top line performance, and the same applies to earnings. We have said that as we have optimized user acquisition spend, we intend to maintain about the same percentage of reinvestment of revenue back into user acquisition. It can go up a little bit over time, but there will be no large swings as it used to be in previous years. With all the new games that we have released over the last year and a half, we have a strong growth foundation to continue to perform. We have the largest number of people in the development teams and in user acquisition teams, and they're doing a great job, and they're preparing new games, and they're preparing amazing new holiday content for existing games. This quarter, again, I think the underlying situation is really beneficial to us because people will probably be spending a little bit more time at home than in prior years. And we can see there's a lot of interest towards entertainment content towards the end of the year, as everyone is spending more time during colder period of the year and kind of reinforced by the reintroduction of the lockdowns. So I think fundamentally, it's a good situation for the company. It continues Q4 and Q1. But that said, I think there's extra attention that mobile games industry has received, and G5 has received, brought us a lot of new players, and this will continue to benefit us in the years to come. And the most important thing is that we have managed to accomplish this strategic transformation where most of the company's revenue is now generated by the company's own games, and we became much more efficient at marketing these games. So this has started even before the COVID wave, and this will be with us even when hopefully this thing is over and we go on with our lives. And I think what happened is that we kind of moved forward towards the curve of the growth, like with all things digital, and this will benefit the industry and ourselves, of course, in the years to come. Let's move on to this next slide if there's anything left. Yeah, this concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad, for that thorough rundown of the G5. And a couple questions for me. I think I'll start off with some questions about your most recent games. Obviously, you released 2 new games here in Q4, Sheriff of Mahjong and also Sherlock, the Hidden Match 3 cases, which you touched upon. And I was just wondering, can you tell anything about the data so far for these games in terms of long-term potential, in terms of revenues?
Yeah, it is still a little bit too early, but we see that Sherlock is performing really well. I think it's a combination of well-known characters, because it's a game about many books, but the main character is Sherlock Holmes. I think it works really well for the players. Sherlock also is a combination of match 3 game and a hidden object game, and both are the favorite genres of our audience. So we see it's not very fast growth, but it's very steady and stable growth with large organic component. So I believe this game is going to perform well. I cannot say on what level, we will see, but there's still a lot to do in terms of the continued development of the game. It doesn't have all the standard quote-unquote features that most of our games have. So there's still a lot of potential for the development team to improve the product over the next couple of quarters. With the Sheriff of Mahjong, I think also it's going to be a stable and good performer in our portfolio of Mahjong games. I think it has potential to be one of the best performing Mahjong games in our portfolio. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And just a final question on your new games. In November you released a game called Supermarket Mania Journey, and I just saw some data from Sensor Tower saying it was your most downloaded game. What are your feelings about that game, and can you say anything about what the data is telling you there?
Supermarket Mania Journey is many years old. I think at least 4 or 5. I think it's one of the examples, but you're right that it generates a lot of downloads. It's one of these games that has been in the harvest mode for a very, very long time, but it continues to drive downloads organically. It's interesting. It's an interesting example because I think in the second quarter last year, it has generated more downloads than any other game in the company's catalog, because there was such interest in supermarkets that we actually saw the downloads for this game go up substantially. And the revenue of this game, I think at that point it tripled or something from a low base, but it contributed to the performance of our old catalog of games quite well. And it's one of the examples of this really long tail of sales of games that were released and put in what we call a harvest mode without much support many years ago, and yet they still continue generating money, and sometimes they even go up on whatever the trend happens in the society that kind of awakens the interest towards this type of games. So it was very interesting for us to see. We even started thinking maybe we need more time management games in our portfolio, although we haven't been making them for some years. Maybe this is something for us to explore.
Thank you. That's quite interesting. Moving on to some questions just in regards to COVID-19. I mean, obviously a lot of mobile gaming companies saw a large inflow of players in Q2. Now there's new lockdowns here in Q4. Are you seeing similar types of inflow as you saw earlier this year, or is it more stable?
Yeah, I would say there was a strong increase in the downloads Q1 to Q2 this year, and then Q3 was kind of the reversal of that. We delivered very strong performance in terms of financials, but underlying new downloads actually went down as people went about their business, having their vacations, etc. Now in Q4, we are seeing that the downloads are coming back to around the level of Q2, which is which is quite interesting. Although I don't think that the lockdowns are as seriously considered as in the second quarter. But nonetheless, we see that there's a lot of downloads, and it's comparable to what we had the second quarter. I think it's just the seasonal effect. Usually, we have a good increase, from Q3 to Q4, and then Q1 is really good performance as well. And we are able to deploy a little bit more user acquisition capital as well, usually in Q4. As I mentioned, it's not going to be a big difference, but it can be slightly higher than before. And I think it's a combination of these 3 things: slightly higher budget on user acquisition, just people really willing to play some games towards the end of the year as it's colder and they spend more time at home and buy their new devices, and also in some form the reintroduction of the lockdowns or this continued background information where authorities are telling them to spend more time at home. It also benefits us.
And also, you kind of touched upon this earlier, but I'm just wondering, what's your view of the long-term effects of COVID-19? Do you think we've created a new, larger base on which you can grow? Or are you seeing that type of retention from the new users which has come in during COVID?
I think we have pushed the civilization, if you will, forward with regard to all things digital, right? We've even when this is over, there will still be a lot more remote conferencing instead of in-person meetings. I believe so. There will be more education online, and people will play more games online. They will interact more with each other online. If you do something for a couple of months, it becomes a habit, especially if this process is enjoyable and convenient, and you see the benefits of doing it. So I think we just had some years of advancement of all things digital kind of compressed into just a couple of quarters. And there are a lot of new habits developed for the population. And this will benefit all things digital in the long run and games as well. So I don't think, I just think it's it's an unfortunate thing that happened, but it at least something good came out of it.
One last question. I think you've probably gotten this question before, but I think it's worth highlighting or asking again because it's kind of gotten some wind recently. And it's in terms of user acquisition and how that might be affected by the upcoming changes to iOS 14 and the IFDA process. Apple is saying that the change is going to come early next year. And it could affect the effectiveness of user acquisition. And I was just wondering, how are you working to prepare for these changes? And do you see them having a large effect on the ROI on user acquisition for G5?
I think the whole industry of advertising, performance advertising, user acquisition is preparing. We hear it from our partners that we work with that they are preparing. I think we will be in the same situation as all the other game developers, right? It's an even playing field. This change happens. It happens for everyone. It may affect prices in the market. Maybe they become lower, but we will still be able to measure the performance. On a level that we did it before, we will continue to be able to measure the performance. There may be some loss of precision or granularity when it comes to measuring the performance on advertising, but I would say we never went to that level. We always operated on a higher scale, like on a cohort level, rather than the level of individuals. So I don't see that this will affect us dramatically. And most important is that this change will affect all companies in the field equally. So we are preparing. We know that our partners are preparing. I think we've made a lot of very important improvements to our tools, and we will comply, of course, with any policies that Apple introduces. But also, I think that Apple, as a company, is really interested in their service revenue, right, and in growing their service revenue, and they were always saying that. So I believe it is in their interests to not, create too much of a trouble for the developers that are driving this revenue. So I think some things will change. I do not expect anything dramatic to happen.
Gotcha. Those are all the questions for me. Thank you, Vlad, for joining us today and presenting G5.
Thank you, Jesper. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.